Happy Halloween. Now, today I'm going to tell you a story based off of a computer game you've probably heard of. Usually I prefer more original content, but this is too good to pass up. So I've got my spooky accessories. I've got my skeleton necklace for cannibal. Also got some not terribly spooky, but very charming spiders. Woo! This is a Halloween costume, just like this. But yes, they'll watch you while you sleep, so be careful. But basically, there's a challenge in the sim world, in The Sims 3, called the Gold Digger, and basically your goal is to see the ghost of your dead spouse. You marry someone wealthy, and then you eliminate them. But I found that you can get away with even more than that and create a very, very complicated and horrific situation for yourself. So, I turned my experiences into a haunted tale filled with murder and fishing and murder and money, and it all revolves around a woman named Elizabeth Mary Keller. Mary Keller, good name for a gold digger, isn't it? Mary Keller. Elizabeth Mary Keller, Curse of the Gold Digger. Let's begin. Sunset Valley was a very insular town. They had little dealings with the outside world, but knew one another very well. They had their doubts when Elizabeth Mary Keller joined their ranks. She was sociable, she was charming, but there was something off about her that others couldn't quite define. Now, Elizabeth was a fastidious woman who wore her dark blonde hair in a prim bun. Her outfit was conservative too, a high-button shirt and blue trousers. The bizarre thing was, she wore an apron. She wore an apron even when going out or going out to visit. No one had ever seen her cook or clean, but that's what she wore. Her makeup, however, didn't seem to match the rest of her. She was heavily rouged with dark red lipstick and heavy eyeshadow. Perhaps that's why the others didn't trust her. Something didn't seem quite right. It was a small town and talk circulated quickly. She had moved into a tiny apartment, and rumor had it she hadn't even furnished it. She didn't sleep, but spent her nights fishing at the pond in Central Park until the sun came up. Elizabeth had been hoping to meet a rich man. She had very little money, and actually very little need for money, considering that she didn't need to eat, or sleep, or even use the bathroom. No, she wasn't a vampire. Just what she considered, well, a perfect specimen of humanity. But she wanted money, as a player wants points in a game. She had moved to the town and learned the names of the major players. Jeffrey Landgraab, doctor, husband of the wealthy Nancy Landgraab, and Nick Alto, who lived with his wife, Vida Alto, and their child across from the Landgraabs. In spite of their proximity, the two wealthy couples were at odds with each other. It was a case of competing businesses and old money versus the nouveau riche. Elizabeth's chance came when she was sitting outside the old bookstore, reading a book on fishing. She loved fishing. She loved to catch the animals, to take them from their natural habitat, and watch them suffocate, slowly. It was her one interest outside of her life's ambition, to marry for money. When Geoffrey Landgraab appeared outside the bookshop, she threw down the book and immediately introduced herself. He was a doctor with shaggy blonde hair and a goofy expression. It wasn't long before they were flirting, and she had invited him back to her house. She was embarrassed by her home. It had no furniture, and she had made no effort to decorate it. Her plans lay elsewhere. But it would have to do. What mattered was that Geoffrey was here. She complimented him and held him in a warm embrace. It wasn't long before they were kissing, and she had lured him into her bed. She was satisfied when he was gone. She learned he was family-oriented, and once she let him to betray his wife, he would feel an obligation toward her. She smiled to herself and finished her book on fishing for lobsters. You could boil them alive, and she liked that idea. That night she headed for Geoffrey's mansion. In Sunset Valley, there was a strange idea of propriety, and she was not breaking any rules. She tidied her apron, and far from being shocked about showing up at his house, Geoffrey met her on the front porch and kissed her. This was going far better than she had expected. They pulled apart, holding hands, and Nancy Landgraab appeared on the porch with a look of shock on her face. Elizabeth smoothed things over, and soon she had charmed Nancy. They walked into the magnificent house, and Elizabeth looked around in awe. She complimented Nancy's home and gushed about the local gossip. They quickly made friends. But as soon as Nancy had gone, Elizabeth took to kissing Geoffrey once again. Their small son Malcolm, wise for his years, knew exactly what was going on, and had called Elizabeth out on her nasty behavior. Elizabeth simply talked about how fond she was of Nancy, but the boy knew better than to believe her. Elizabeth walked up to the bedroom where Nancy and Geoffrey were fighting. Neither seemed upset with her, but they were furious with one another. The boy, the little upstart, managed to get Elizabeth kicked out of the house. She walked partly out and to a nearby pond to fish. She promptly took out her phone and invited Geoffrey to join her. Yes, it was late, but he had been up all night fighting with his wife, and he happily came to see her. She was enjoying seeing a trout in his death throes, but quickly turned to Geoffrey. He had been fighting with his wife, and he didn't think the marriage would work out. She asked if she and him, Elizabeth and Geoffrey, could be together, and he joyfully agreed. They then took the plunge, and she proposed marriage. Yes, he said. By now Nancy came and was snarling at Elizabeth, but Elizabeth simply walked away, her apron flouncing. She had the power now. The wedding was celebrated on the beach. There were few guests, but poor young Malcolm had been forced to come. Elizabeth had seen to that. The laws in Sunset Valley concerning divorce were terribly unjust. Basically, the party that had broken up the couple had the right to decide how the households would be divided. Malcolm and Nancy were thrust into Elizabeth's ugly little unfurnished home, and she lived in the mansion with Geoffrey. That night Elizabeth walked into her new home, sighing with delight. She had achieved her dream. Well, almost. She didn't like sharing things. And though she enjoyed the triumph of the wedding, she didn't like being married. Her husband was warming himself by a stove, and she locked him in. She realized, now that she had taken over the household, she could influence his power. This was another great injustice in Sunset Valley. She pushed him to stoke the fire, over and over and over, until it consumed him. The flames enveloped him. But Elizabeth, she was thinking about other things. But she felt a sadness in her heart because she was in a way in love. But she had to do what she was born to do. The Grim Reaper came and took her husband away, leaving a gravestone in his place. By now it was early morning. She picked up the stone and carried it with her. She already had several trout in her purse. She had an uncanny ability to hold things. Lots of things. She cleaned up the floor. She didn't like mess, especially now that the house was hers, entirely hers. Now it was morning. Elizabeth hadn't slept, but she didn't need to, and it was the perfect time to visit the Alto household across the street. They were her neighbors after all, and she had a slight advantage over them. The Landgraabs were old money, and she had married into them. But the Alto house was bigger and finer and more lavish, which suited Elizabeth's tastes. She hit it off with Vida Alto, in whom she saw many of her own traits. The middle-aged woman was grasping and selfish. It would have disturbed her to see such a rival, but she knew she could outsmart her. She exchanged a few friendly greetings with Nick, Vida's husband, but focused on the wife. Elizabeth stopped every few minutes to sob uncontrollably over her husband's death, but she quickly recovered herself and continued her cheerful conversation. Soon Vida Alto trusted her almost completely. They were best friends, and Elizabeth asked her to move in. Vida agreed with surprising alacrity. Perhaps she was tired of her life in the Alto household. Perhaps she wanted to see what the Landgraabs had had that she didn't. As soon as Vida had moved in, Elizabeth had gained an extra $20,000 in cash, and in addition, a much greater power. She could now influence Vida's behavior. So under Elizabeth's direction, Vida walked straight to her husband and divorced him. And the two walked back to Elizabeth's house. Now, Elizabeth, in a way, missed Geoffrey. She tended to want what she couldn't have. So when she received a call from the local science center asking her if she wanted to participate in an experiment to create ghosts from human remains, she gladly agreed. She dropped Geoffrey's tombstone and returned with his ghost, transparent and orange from his fiery death. Geoffrey the ghost didn't seem to resent her for murdering him. In fact, he still considered himself in a relationship with Elizabeth. Now that he was back, she was irritated with him, but there are advantages to having a ghost in love with you, so she put up with it. Now it was her time to deal with Vida. They had so much in common, and she really enjoyed her friend's company, but wouldn't do to have Vida in the way when she had won over Nick. She had Vida take a swim and trapped her in the pool. She sent Geoffrey off to get dinner at a local bistro. She didn't want him in the way either, considering he believed they were technically in a relationship. She wasn't sure he would enjoy his dinner very much, being a ghost. And then she invited her darling Nick over. Nick was easier to win over than Geoffrey. She discovered he was mean-spirited, but that wasn't exactly a problem. They were soon making out in the front yard, and in his passion, Nick accepted a proposal of marriage. As they leaned in to kiss each other to cement their bond, who should return but the ghost Geoffrey, and he caught them kissing. It was as though a dagger had gone through him, that is, if he still had flesh. Elizabeth tried to sweet-talk him out of it, but she had gone too far. He was furious, very furious. At about the same time, Vida had taken her last gasp of air. While she had been drowning, the man she had been forced to divorce had engaged himself to her killer. She transformed into a dripping blue ghost and was taken by the Grim Reaper. With Geoffrey mad at her, Elizabeth had no one to gloat to about the wedding. Plus, in spite of her best efforts to be cheerful, she was sad about Vita's death. She traveled to the science lab, had her friend transformed, and brought her back to join the household. Who knew? Perhaps Vita and Geoffrey would hit it off. No such luck. The ghosts had been enemies from the old days and argued from the start. It was hard to put up with their constant arguing, and harder when Geoffrey decided he had had enough and broke up with Elizabeth. It really hurt. How could he be so cruel? It broke her, and she ran to her bedroom and sobbed. But still, she was who she was, and she continued her plotting. She would have a quiet wedding in the backyard with Nick, so it would go off without a hitch. The two ghosts attended and actually danced with each other at the wedding. But the dance soon turned into fighting, so fiercely that they became worse enemies than they were before. Elizabeth sold the Landgraab mansion and moved in with Nick. She made a cool $300,000 on the bargain. Elizabeth decided that her new husband should live through the night. She had a strong urge to kill him, but her choices were so few. It had to look like an accident. Perhaps he could electrocute himself? He was too skilled with tools. It was unlikely. In the meantime, she decided she wanted to have a child, a baby. Someone to continue the Mary Keller line and way of life. She slept with her husband, and when he went to wash his hands, she locked him in the bathroom. Starvation was a very tedious and, in Elizabeth's mind, a very unoriginal way to kill a man, but it would have to do. And then there was Nick's daughter. What to do with her? She hesitated, thinking that perhaps she could train the girl in her ways. As her belly grew, her husband's cries grew louder and more insistent. It was very irritating and quite selfish of him. She was the type to gestate quickly, and on the day she gave birth to her daughter, her husband passed away from starvation. Elizabeth had taken elementary Spanish and named the girl Muerta Padre. It wasn't quite grammatically correct in any language, but it was a good name for a little girl whose father had died on the day she was born. And Elizabeth now had a new stone to add to her collection. She wanted to resuscitate him, but she feared that he and his ex-wife would join together and cause problems for her. No. Elizabeth Mary Keller moved her household, the two ghosts, her daughter, and Nick's daughter, into a modest home, leaving her with about $600,000 from the sale of the two houses. She had done well in town and considered trying some other residents, but there was no one as impressive as the Landgraabs and the Altos, and it seemed a waste of time. Sunset Valley was a strange place indeed. But over time, the squabbles of the ghosts of people she had murdered began to drive her insane. She neglected Muerta Padre, leaving the girls to the doubtful hands of the two ghosts. She turned back to fishing in the graveyard for death fish, which didn't actually kill anyone at all, but could be used to grow a plant that would ward off the Grim Reaper. Elizabeth was very disappointed when she found this out. She made friends with the ghosts in the graveyard, but every morning they disappeared, and when they came again at night, they had forgotten her. It was a very empty way of life. But it was a life she had made for herself, and it had been a challenge and a thrill. But the cost would be great nothingness when she accomplished what she set out for. So I want to end here and just say that even in games such as The Sims, you can face consequences for your actions, though they aren't really as serious as you would find in real life. Basically, Elizabeth wasn't punished, but through boredom. and nothing else. So that's the end of the story, and happy Halloween!